Have you ever wondered how your ancestors could afford a passage across the Atlantic? In this video, we'll explore the four most common ways that made that journey possible. And as you'll see, the answer depended not only on how much money they had, but also on when they emigrated. Let's travel back more than 300 years. Imagine you've made one of the biggest decisions of your life. You've decided to leave Europe forever and begin a new life in America. There's just one small problem. You can't actually afford to get there. So, what could you do? Let's begin with one of the earliest answers to that question. This document offered thousands of people something they otherwise might never have had: the chance to reach America. It was called an indenture. By signing this legal agreement before leaving Europe, an immigrant promised to work for several years after arriving in America. In return, someone else paid for the passage across the Atlantic. For many people, this single sheet of paper changed the course of their lives. If your family came from England, Scotland, or Ireland, one of your ancestors may have signed a document very much like this. Now here's the key point. The agreement was made before the journey began, before boarding the ship, before seeing the Atlantic, before catching even a first glimpse of America. The emigrant had already committed to working there. Sometimes the agreement was made directly with a future employer. In many other cases, however, a merchant or ship captain paid for the passage first and later transferred the contract after arrival. But regardless of who financed the passage, the principle remained the same. The indenture contract always came first. Most contracts lasted somewhere between 4 and 7 years. During that time, the employer was expected to provide food, clothing, and a place to live. And when the contract ended, many servants received what was known as freedom dues. Depending on the colony and the time period, these could include money, clothing, tools, or other goods to help them begin their new lives. In other words, it certainly wasn't a free ticket. It was simply paid for in a different currency: years of work. Life as an indentured servant was rarely easy. Working conditions varied greatly. Some employers treated their servants fairly, others did not. Yet despite the hardships, indentured servitude gave thousands of people an opportunity they otherwise could not have afforded: a passage to America. And for many families, it was merely the first step towards an entirely new future. This system was especially common among immigrants from England, Scotland, and Ireland during the 1600s and much of the 1700s. But this was not the path taken by everyone. Especially for many families from the German-speaking parts of Europe, another way of financing the journey became far more common. And that's where our story goes next. Instead of signing a contract before they left Europe, many Germans simply boarded the ship without knowing exactly how their passage would eventually be paid for. Historians refer to these emigrants as redemptioners. The name comes from the idea of redeeming or paying off the cost of the passage after arriving in America. For many families, the journey began with a remarkable amount of uncertainty. Unlike indentured servants, redemptioners crossed the Atlantic without a binding employment contract. After arriving, usually in Philadelphia, they had to find a way to pay for their passage. By the 1700s, Philadelphia had become the main gateway for many German-speaking immigrants to North America. A few passengers were fortunate. Relatives or friends were waiting at the docks, ready to pay the outstanding fare and welcome them into a new life. For most, however, no one came. Instead, the ship's captain or his agent searched for someone willing to pay the debt. Prospective employers boarded the vessels or examined the new arrivals on the docks, judging their health, strength, age, and skills. A skilled craftsman might attract several interested employers. Others had far fewer choices. Whoever agreed to pay the passage received the immigrant's promise to work for a number of years until the debt had been repaid. For many families, this was the moment they feared most. There was no guarantee that husbands and wives would remain together, or that parents would stay with their children. If different employers offered to pay for different family members, families could be separated before they had even taken their first steps in the new world. Those for whom no arrangement was found remained under the authority of the ship's captain or his agent, waiting, sometimes for days, for someone to claim their contract. Imagine surviving a dangerous Atlantic crossing, only to discover that the greatest uncertainty still lay ahead. This system became especially important during the mid-1700s. For many families, it was the only realistic way to cross the Atlantic. If your roots lie in Germany, Switzerland, Alsace, or neighboring regions, this may well have been your family's story. The system worked surprisingly well for many decades, but it also carried risks. Before reaching America, no one could be completely certain how the debt would be settled, or who would eventually provide the money. Everything depended on what happened after the ship reached port. For some, that worked out well. Others weren't nearly as lucky. By the early 1800s, the nature of German immigration was beginning to change. A wave of immigration, triggered by a devastating natural disaster, brought thousands of additional immigrants to America's shores. If you would like to learn more about why so many people had to leave regions such as Baden, Württemberg, the Palatinate, Switzerland, Alsace, and Tyrol during this period, I've covered that tragic story in a separate video. You'll find a link in the description below. For the redemptional system, however, this dramatic increase in migration created new challenges. Ship captains now faced a growing problem: finding enough employers willing and able to redeem the passengers of those thousands of immigrants now suddenly arriving in America. At the same time, immigrant communities in North America continued to grow, creating new ways to finance the passage before departure. Over the following decades, the redemptional system thus gradually disappeared. So, what changed? The answer came from something much more personal than a contract or a debt: family and friends. By the 1800s, the world of immigration was changing. Ocean crossings became much more affordable, communication across the Atlantic improved, and immigrant communities in America grew stronger. Imagine leaving Europe for a new life across the ocean and knowing that someone you trusted was already there waiting for you. For the first time, many immigrants no longer had to depend on strangers after arriving. Instead, they could rely on people they already knew. As more and more Europeans settled in North America, family networks continued to grow. Children wrote to their parents. Brothers wrote to sisters. Friends wrote to neighbors back home. And every now and then, one of those letters contained something even more exciting than stories about America: the opportunity to begin a new life. Instead of paying for the voyage after arriving, relatives or friends could now arrange and pay for the passage before the emigrants even left Europe. There wasn't just one way to do this. Sometimes the actual ticket was mailed across the Atlantic. In other cases, the shipping company informed one of its local agents in Europe, who then issued the ticket before departure. In rare cases, even local communities paid for poor families to emigrate because supporting them to get to America was considered cheaper than having to support them at home. Either way, the result was the same. The emigrants began their journey knowing that their passage had already been paid for. This made emigration far more predictable. Families could help one another across generations. One successful immigrant helped the next, then another, and another. Maybe that's how your own family's journey continued. What had once depended on employers increasingly depended on family networks instead. For many immigrants, the most important document they carried was not just a ticket. It was a letter from someone who had already made the journey. So far, we've looked at 3 different ways immigrants could cross the Atlantic without having enough money to pay for the passage themselves. In fact, all 3 methods had one thing in common. They made immigration possible for people who otherwise couldn't have afforded the journey. But one method of paying for the passage had been available from the very beginning, and it never disappeared. If you had enough money, you simply paid for the passage yourself. No employer, no redemption, no prepaid ticket. Just buy the ticket, pack your belongings, and go. This was always possible, but not everyone could afford it. For poorer families, the cost of crossing the Atlantic often represented several months or even years of income. Yet some people were able to make the journey using their own resources. Merchants, successful craftsmen, farmers who had sold their property, or families who had saved for years could leave Europe without depending on anyone else. For them, the voyage was not a debt to repay. It was an investment in a new future. To understand how these different paths fit together, let's take one final look at the timeline. Because the way an immigrant paid for the passage depended largely on 2 things: when they left and where they came from. Indentured servitude was especially common among immigrants from England, Scotland, and Ireland during the 1600s and early 1700s. First came the contract, then the passage. For many immigrants from the German-speaking parts of Europe during the mid-1700s and into the early 1800s, the redemptioner system became especially important. This time, the passage came first, and payment followed after arrival. As immigrant communities grew throughout North America, prepaid tickets became increasingly common during the 1800s for immigrants across Europe. The passage was paid before departure, often by someone who had already made the journey and wanted to have another person follow. And throughout every century, those who could afford it simply paid for the passage themselves. Together, these 4 methods tell the story of how immigration itself changed over time. The price of a new life was different for every family. Some paid with money, others paid with years of labor. Either way, your ancestor found a way to pay for their passage. In our next episode, we'll follow those immigrants from the German-speaking parts of Europe who crossed the Atlantic during the 1700s. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they leave? And what happened after they arrived in America? What can their stories tell us about the men and women whose choices brought your family to America? And if you haven't seen the first part of the series yet, you can watch it right here. It tells the story of the very first German settlers who crossed the Atlantic during the 1600s and how their journey laid the foundation for everything that followed. If you enjoy exploring the history of German immigration and genealogy, I'd be delighted to have you join me for the next episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.